Before we start a very exciting panel discussion on the topic of drug affordability, we have a very short introductory video from the WHO Director General who wasn't able to join today, but it will set the scene very nicely for the discussion afterwards.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. The World Health Organization was founded in 1948 on the conviction that health is a human right to be enjoyed by all people, not a privilege for the few. 70 years later, that conviction remains at the core of everything we do. No one should get sick or die just because they are poor or because they cannot access the services or products they need. That's what we mean by universal health coverage. And access to health technologies, vaccines, diagnostics, medicines, and medical devices is a key pillar of universal health coverage. Everyday advances in science and medicine bring new hope to people around the world. New vaccines and drugs for diseases like hepatitis C and cancer are transforming people's lives. But not everyone has equal access to these medical advances. Lack of access to health technologies is rarely due to a single reason. There are many, including intellectual property and trade. We believe in companies making fair profit on their innovations, but we do not believe in systems that put the protection of intellectual property ahead of the protection of health. Patients must always come before patents. Thank you for your energy and commitment to improving human health. Your ideas and innovations will save and extend lives, bringing hope to many. But they will not be truly innovative if they remain out of reach for the poorest and most vulnerable. So I urge you to harness the power of innovation for everyone, everywhere. I wish you a successful summit. I thank you.
Well, I can't say it's every day that I host a panel where the Director General of the World Health Organization gives the preview. But I think that gives us some sense of the importance of the topic that we're going to talk about. And I think what you see here is a panel that reflects years of experience, wisdom, and quite frankly, success in tackling some of these topics. So my name is indeed Brindan Suresh, and the way we're going to do this is we're going to start with an introduction from each of the panelists. Then I'm going to kickstart things with them, where we'll have a bit of a conversation between the five of us. But the real conversation that we want to have is with all of you. So as much as possible, we're then going to open it up to questions and answers, so it becomes a discussion. And with no further ado, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to just give a brief introduction about themselves. Dr. Hamied, give it a go. Lots of experience.
I'm a Cambridge alumni. I was here in the mid-50s, did my PhD in Cambridge, and then came and worked in a pharmaceutical company in India. So I've been very much involved in the drug industry way back since the mid-50s. So that's all I can say to youngsters who are here. I can tell you a lot about healthcare and about the pharma industry, and perhaps a few minutes later, we'll talk about that.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. My name is Jeanne, and I have a PhD in health services research, and I went straight from that to work in government. So I've worked at the White House for 2 different administrations for 10 years, Health and Human Services for another 4 years, and most recently I worked on the Affordable Care Act for President Obama, trying to expand access to care, and as far as we have more work to do. So I'm at a think tank currently, where I'm looking at new ideas for the next generation of health reform.
I'm Bill Haseltine. I've had a career in fundamental research as a professor at Harvard, working on cancer first and then on AIDS. I was one of the first AIDS researchers. Then, as overlapping, I helped create biotechnology companies. I've had the good fortune to create at least 10, and I'm still creating a few more. And from those companies, we have 8 products that have been approved by the FDA. in one form or another, and a couple of products for the industrial businesses as well. After that second part of my career, where I was head of and created Human Genome Sciences, for the last 10 years, I've created a foundation called Access Health International that has the purpose of trying to assure that people everywhere have access to high-quality, affordable health. And we work in a number of countries: China, India, Philippines, Northern Europe, the United States. And as the previous speaker pointed out, access to equitable health is at least as important as access to high-quality pharmaceuticals, because without that access, the pharmaceuticals that we develop cannot be used.
Hi everyone, my name is Christina Vandoros. I work for Johnson & Johnson. So I started there probably 20 years ago. My background is I'm an economist, and I've been working in various functions from local companies, European functions, global, in the areas of mostly health economics related functions. Currently, I'm working in a position that was created a few years ago called Macroeconomics and Health Policy, because we recognize the broader macroeconomic issues that relate to health, looking at things around expenditure in health and expenditure in pharmaceuticals, policies that relate to pricing and things like that. So I'd like to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. So this panel is essentially on the topic of drug affordability. But when we talk about drug affordability, in many ways what we're actually talking about is value. So our systems and patients getting value, and access. Are they actually able to get to the product? And so before we do anything else, I thought it was a good idea maybe for Christina to give us a perspective on what factors from start to finish actually contribute to the final price of a drug product.
Okay. I'll try and do this as briefly as I can, and I'm going to try and give a bit of a global perspective, even though I work for Europe. So, and it's a topic that's not very easy to generalize. So, yeah, pricing, it's a complex issue. It's a very emotive issue, of course, of pharmaceuticals. I think before we go there, just to give a bit of background, perhaps, on kind of the unique model of the pharmaceutical industry. So, a couple of professors where I was discussing with them always describe it as an industry with a high sunk cost. So the model's quite challenging. Then you have a road to market full of lots of challenges, so very few products make it to market, there are high risks, and a lot of evidence requirements that are now becoming more and more. Then the cost of production is low, so we have a low marginal cost. And of course, then easy imitation. So when the patent expires, then we move into a situation so you have a limited time frame to really commercialize your product. So that's really kind of the system which we work. And then, I mean, when we consider, I'll speak from my company perspective, right? When we consider pricing, there are a few elements that we take into account. So the first element is the value of the product. So what it delivers to patients in terms of health benefits, what it delivers in terms of value, that's very important, economic benefits. So does it improve productivity? Does it bring back, so you spend on the medicine, but you save in other areas? So the value is one key pillar of what we consider when we're starting to consider the issue of pricing. The second issue is access and affordability. So we do recognize there are challenges around the globe, and it's very important that people have. So we work with governments and other partners to find various tools to make sure the products are as broadly available as possible. And the third issue, of course, is sustaining our innovation, because the model is quite risky and there are challenges with that, and we want to make sure that a healthy industry can then attract investors and then bring back innovation again. So it's all to make sure you maintain the cycle of innovation. So that's kind of our perspective of what we consider, but then that's just, that doesn't cut it, because of course then there are so many other elements that play in, and depending of course on the country and the region, there are so many systems and so many techniques that come in place to define the final price. So lots of markets, for example, look at cost effectiveness of the drugs, and they evaluate them with very strict techniques and robust techniques to prove the value of that medicine. Others look at the clinical benefit. There are all other systems that just do things like reference pricing, so comparing prices in other countries and benchmarking to them. Lots of discounts take place with hospitals. and other stakeholders. So there's a whole complex process and a lot of regulation, of course, depending on the country, because all the systems are very different, that play in to set kind of the final price that will be available. And then in the end, when you actually reach the price, I mean, just to put some perspective, that's what one would say the retail price or the list price. There are, of course, discounts on that. And of course, I mean, the manufacturer in the end doesn't get that whole piece because there are the various other, the wholesalers, the pharmacists, taxation, for example. In Europe, roughly 60% goes to the manufacturer and the rest go to taxation and the various other stakeholders, pharmacists and wholesalers, just to give you a bit of the flavor of it. So that's kind of in the summary.
Perfect.
It's very difficult to summarize this. It's a very big issue and very country specific as well. But I think that's kind of a broad, if I could generalize a bit, that's sort of a broad picture of the world.
No, thank you. I think that's really, really helpful perspective. The next person I wanted to ask a question to was you, Bill, which is basically modern medicine has made enormous strides, but we know there also remains, significant unmet need that requires ongoing innovation, and you've pioneered that in AIDS and other areas. So tell us, based on all of that, what are your reflections for industry and for regulators when it comes to finding the balance between delivering innovation and delivering value?
One of the things that we've seen at this conference is the enormous potential for contemporary science to deliver truly marvelous cures. The drugs that will get us, that we're now developing from 80 to 100 in good shape, and pretty soon we'll be developing drugs for your generation that will get you to 100 to 120 in good shape. And those are very likely to be highly specific, targeted drugs for small populations at enormous cost. How are we going to afford that in rich countries? When you look at the counter pressure, and I can tell you as a pharmaceutical executive, when you go to, say, to the editorial board of the New York Times and you say, I've got genomics and we're going to create new drugs. What is the response? You capitalist, you're going to rip us off once again. You're going to develop drugs that we can't afford, before they even ask you about what the drug is. That's a real reaction, because the cost of healthcare, I don't say drugs, the cost of healthcare is becoming unaffordable for our societies. And the issue of drug pricing is not just an issue of drugs, it's an issue of healthcare. And we have, however you look at it, very inefficient healthcare systems. Part of the answer to drug pricing, especially for these new medicines that will be priced, as you heard from Rick Klausner, at very high prices, is that you can afford it if the healthcare systems are efficient, which ours are not. So you have to look not just at drug prices themselves, you'll have to look at the efficiencies of the entire healthcare system. Now, that's for the wealthy countries. We also have some inefficiencies and some inequities in wealthy countries for drugs. For example, let's take a drug I find particularly egregious, injectable Tylenol. The company that makes that is now worth about $4 billion. Is that right? Shouldn't anybody be able to make injectable Tylenol? It's totally ridiculous that we have these rules that allow drugs to be reformulated and then sold at exorbitant prices, which drive up our healthcare costs. That's, to me, nonsense. Another, I think, misuse of our patent system is pharmaceutical companies that take biologicals and extend their lives with very modest modifications and cost us a huge amount. So there's certain things we can do in drug pricing, even in rich countries, that can make a big difference. But the biggest difference we can make, after all, pharmaceuticals account for no more than 15% of healthcare costs, is try to reduce that overall burden of healthcare costs through efficient, rational systems. And those systems I'll talk about a little later, about some of my thoughts of how we can reduce overall healthcare systems. When it comes to other countries, we have completely different problems. There, you have a question of access to the drugs that exist. What is the correct pricing for those drugs that exist? It isn't so much a question of innovation. It's a question of how you get the drugs. I'm happy to say we have on the panel one of the great innovators, Dr. Hamied, who's made drugs available globally. In fact, I now source my drugs from his company. When I go to India, I load up on his drugs, which I can get at 1/50th the price that I get in the United States for the exact
And the
same
quality,
drug.
and the quality.
And the quality, I have to say. I always ask for the Cipla drugs because I'm guaranteed of high quality. Not all the drugs in India are the same quality. But there are real issues of how you make drugs affordable. And most of the issues that we see in the emerging world are drugs that have been existing for a long time that people don't have access to. And fortunately, in some countries, those prices are reasonable, and in others, they're not. For example, if you look for the same drugs in China, and not everybody in China is rich, you have to pay what we pay in America. Is that right? I don't think that's right. And that's the same true in many countries. So I think there's a tremendous room for innovation in drug pricing. It's beginning to happen, but we have to do a lot more.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you. Dr. Hamied. It's really quite an amazing story because for almost 60 years, I think, you've had an unstinting passion to make sure that access is secured for some of the world's most economically challenged places when it comes to drugs and their affordability. Now, what do you believe, however, because not everybody, but many people in this room are from so-called developed markets and countries. What do people from those places need to better understand so that they can effectively collaborate on access in so-called emerging countries?
I can talk to you all only on the pharma industry. So those students here who are targeting their future in healthcare, I think I'm addressing to you. I think the first question, you must understand what is the pharma industry. We produce medicines, tablets, capsules, syrups, injectables, etc. If you leave academia and go and join a pharmaceutical company, my first advice to you is learn from the shop floor. Go and learn how tablets are made. Go and learn how, before you start your R&D career. I only heard yesterday R&D, 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 but that's not the basic grounding that I would suggest. Also, you're entering an industry where two things count the most. One is obsolescence. Drugs come and drugs go. The drugs that made us famous, my company famous 20 years ago, they don't sell anymore. Newer drugs have replaced them. So there's obsolescence. So you do something like Greg Winter was here. The drugs that he developed, fantastic drugs, are just going off patent. Newer drugs are replacing them. So that you have to bear in mind. The second important question you have to bear in mind is the word monopoly. The pharma industry, the big pharma, essentially exists on monopoly. Dr. Haseltine just mentioned that even, so my suggestion to the third world boys here is what I have done in the last 10, 15 years of my life is what I call incremental innovation. I'm not there to discover a new drug. Even if I have discovered a new drug, which I have done in the past, nobody in the medical profession accepts it. I did develop a drug, showed it to the medical doctors in India, and they looked at it and said, Dr. Hamied, if this drug is as good as you say it is, how come Pfizer and Glaxo haven't brought it out before you? That acceptability, don't forget, a country like India, for 300 years we were colonized, that colonial mentality among the medical profession still exists. And I think you'll vouch for that, Kiran. So this is something I think you all should bear in mind. The other question is, what is the value of a drug if the patient can't afford it? But like earlier it was mentioned, you should look at the totality of healthcare. The drugs form maybe 15% of the total cost of healthcare. Diagnostics, equipment, testing, MRI, this, that, the other. So the drug per se, and everybody always points a finger at drug pricing. It's not only drug pricing. You have to look at the totality. When it comes to monopoly, it's a very, very touchy subject. And I'd like to give you an example. I mentioned it yesterday to some of the boys here, of a company called Gilead, who invented a drug for hepatitis C. The drug is Sovaldi. They did not know how to price it. What should they price it in America? So what they did, nothing to do with costing. So I was asked this at a seminar like this on Sovaldi's pricing. And this is what I said. I said, I'm an Indian. I worry about India. What happens in America is no concern of mine. Gilead went to the insurance companies in America and said, you insure hepatitis C patients? They said, yes, we do. What does it cost you to maintain one patient for 1 year? And the companies, the insurance companies came forward and said it costs us $168,000 to maintain one patient in America for 1 year. And at that time, there was no cure. So Gilead said, if we give you a drug at half that price, 84 tablets for 12 weeks, 1 tablet a day, at half the price, $84,000, which not only will maintain your patient, but will cure his hepatitis C, will you accept? They jumped at it. Now what happened in the third world? Here was a company, Gilead, that came to India and gave a license to 10 Indian companies to market Sofosbuvir, the generic drug. Guess what is the price in India today? $250 against 84,000. On that $250, I give a 7% royalty to Gilead. I'm a scientist. I think science has to be respected and protected. Nobody wants anything free. So what I would like to suggest through this forum and later on when you all enter pharma industry is to be a little more magnanimous to the third world. Because particularly on the patent issues like this, what you do in various countries, and you talk about drug affordability, it varies country to country. So here, the other big example is on the question of AIDS. When the pricing in America was $15,000 per patient per year, we came out at below $1 a day for a cocktail of drugs. Legally, we came out. So that makes a big difference. We like to be legal and not break laws. And this is where I would strongly suggest, because you've got a very good list of companies there, pharma companies, who should be magnanimous to the third world. You can't have the same laws for the North and the South. And give their major products required in the third world under voluntary licensing or some sort of a cooperation whereby they will get access and affordability. I think the two go hand in hand. Access and at the same time, affordability and pricing should not come in the way of newer development. So this is also a very, very major issue. And I think the patent system, etc., licensing has to be done. And we, 2 years ago at the UN, had a panel discussion for access to medicine and strategies to promote innovation and health technology. And I'm giving here one of, if you all would like, a copy of the report on, you could circulate it later on if you like, who opposed the report? The American government. Sorry, this report is incorrect because the American system is based on monopoly. And then they said, this is a true story I'm telling you. To my leader.
Her time will come, Dr. Hamied.
Your time will come, but the time will come after me. I must be able to respond. What happened, the American at this meeting, they said, all the money for donations to the Global Fund through PEPFAR for AIDS, we are donating, Americans are donating. I said, fine, you are donating, but there is not one donation that comes from America without strings attached. Like PEPFAR, when we were giving the AIDS drugs to Africa, they said, sorry, only those drugs that are approved for marketing in America qualify for PEPFAR. I mean, we are here courtesy Gates Foundation. You will see with Gates Foundation, they will never give you a donation for any product that comes in the way of American intellectual property. Bear that in mind, because it happened to us with the Gates Foundation on AIDS. The drugs have to conform, if they buy drugs, it has to conform to the American patent system and the American laws. So this is something you all have to bear in mind, monopoly, obsolescence, and patenting. Then I've given, this is the report here. The other thing that I think you should bear in mind, in the pharma industry, which I said nobody's raised it so far, and give me 2 minutes for that, is the foundation of the pharmaceutical industry is what? Can anybody tell me? The foundation is the active pharmaceutical ingredients, the APIs. If you don't have the active substances, how are you going to make the end product? Today, China and India between them control probably 50 to 60%, if not more, of the API world market. God forbid, if there's a fight between China and India, the Indian pharma industry would shut down. We are so much dependent on China. If India and China combine and tell the rest of the world, go to hell, there won't be, within 3 months, the world will be starved of drugs. So I think what is also important for youngsters like you to bear in mind, how do you protect your own country where you come from, and what steps should the international community take to protect? The Indian government asked me 2 years ago for some advice. I said, adopt the 80-20 principle. Buy 80% from outside, but make 20% irrespective of the cost, so that in an emergency, you've got that 20%. Let me give you one example. Penicillin. 85% of the world penicillin comes from China. And what is penicillin used for? As a starting material to make antibiotics. Tomorrow, if they say, sorry, we don't supply India penicillin, what happens to all the antibiotics produced in India? Vitamin B12, there's no manufactured in India. And that's essential, all the vitamins, nothing made in India. So, like Dr. Haseltine mentioned on paracetamol injectable, there is a big scope for you boys once you leave academia,
girls,
and girls, of course, in traditional medicines which are not being produced. So this is something I think we tend to forget when we say affordability and pricing of drugs. Where are the essential raw materials? APIs being made, where do they come from? Who makes them? What is the pricing? Because the pricing of the finished product depends on the price of the raw material as well. So these are a few thoughts.
Thank you, Dr. Hamied. Now, I have to say, as a moderator, I've got my eye on the clock.
Oh, sorry.
And we want to open this up to discussion. But equally, I think you would understand that as a moderator, when someone is speaking with the passion that you bring, Dr. Hamied, I think it was worth it. Now, with the final word, though, before we open it up, is Jeanne. So, Jeanne.
The Americans always have the last word.
Is that going to be you for your 15 minutes?
And the first word.
You can see that wrapping up this panel is going to be fun. Okay, so, Jeanne, you have been, and I think you're on safe ground now as an ex-government official, shall we say, but you have, in all seriousness, been, I think, and have seen every shade of every debate on value and access in the United States. And I think, this room would give you full credit as one of the few people that has actually come close to wrestling that beast to the ground via the Affordable Care Act. And as also the one person on our panel who has actually been the payer to some extent, how do you think health systems can best prepare for the next wave of innovation that Bill described and our panelists so far have also alluded to?
Sure. And it's a challenge because we heard a lot, and I think Christina used the word value. Value-based payment is a term that is coming into our debate, and oftentimes it's hard to figure out what that means. What is value? How do you measure outcomes, cost, quality? And in the cost equation, what's included? Both the whole panel talked about the fact that you can't isolate the cost of a drug or a device without looking at the other types of healthcare costs. So value is a great idea. It is hard to measure in concept. And as an example, our last year, the Obama administration, we tried to do demonstrations on value-based purchasing. Oncology bundle payments, so we're actually trying to combine the costs of the physician services, chemotherapy, and other related services into one payment to incentivize quality. We looked at reference pricing, incident-based pricing, et cetera. Didn't go far, in part because when you had these conversations, it often, going back to the term monopoly, proved to be that. And one example was one particular company came in and said, we have an idea. We think our drug is so good, don't pay us unless it actually delivers after the fact, which is a great idea except for the fact that it could afford to do that and none of its competitors could. So it was actually an indirect form of monopoly, an exclusivity extension. So it's a challenge to figure that out, but I do want to go back to the basics. I do think oftentimes we let the complexity of pharmaceutical pricing overwhelm it. I think we have three obvious problems in our US policy, which I will explain later if you're interested, why people who care about global policy should focus on. Number one is we're price takers for the most part in the US. Most of our insurance company plans now, and it's an access issue, protect people against out-of-pocket costs. In Medicare, it's if your costs are greater than, your drug costs are greater than $88,400. In private insurance, if all of your costs are greater than $7,000, insurance pays and you pay nothing, basically, which means there's no incentive for people switching drugs. There's a lot of incentives to price your drugs just above those thresholds because it's harder to negotiate for those drugs. And indeed, we've seen that in the US, the 2% of people who use biosimilar or biologic drugs now account for 27 to 40% of total spending, because again, it's above that threshold and it's very expensive. With a big open question, we heard about this a little bit yesterday about innovation. Are we actually getting true innovation per dollar spent for this, or are we seeing lots of drugs in the same or similar therapeutic classes for cancer and high prevalence conditions where the reward for the fixed costs that are given may be higher? So open question about whether we're price takers for brand name drugs. On generics, unfortunately in the US, we have many games. Pay for delay, brand name companies paying generic companies to stay out of the market. We see other examples of companies profiting off of older drugs that are off patent. You all have heard of the Pharma Bro. That's one example of somebody finding profit in taking old patents, charging 400% more than the previous day, and having our pricing system take it. So we have challenges in our own generic market as well. And third, we have intermediaries. There's a whole lot that happens between the drug manufacturers and the consumers, insurers who take a cut, physicians and hospitals that take a cut. There's a recent study that estimated that 20% of all US healthcare spending is not going to pharmaceutical manufacturers, it's going somewhere in the middle, which is a lot of money and obviously something our public policymakers are beginning to take on. So I say all that because going back to basic supply and demand, we're going to see, I think, an increase in our payers in the US demanding more value for their dollar. And that includes President Trump, who we heard yesterday will be giving a speech on this next week. Will be President Trump. He'll be talking about drug prices. And we can talk about what he's going to be talking about, which is different. But it's out there. But remember, we also saw JP Morgan, Amazon, Berkshire Hathaway, 3 of our big corporate titans in the US said that healthcare costs are eating up. I think that Warren Buffett used the word tapeworm of our healthcare system, and they are looking at drug costs as one of the major issues or problems that they want to drive at. So we're seeing greater demand side interest in the US, which I think will translate. But lastly, I think we're seeing interesting supply side developments. Intermountain Health, which is a company in Utah, has now teamed with, I think, close to 100 different hospitals to say, you know what, for generics, for the antibiotics, for the drugs that are out there and proven, we can make them cheaper. So we're actually developing a manufacturing capacity to put some of those generic drug companies to the test. So I think we ought to pull back and just remember demand and supply do work. We've seen that in the generic area. So trying to do more on those 2 functions, I think, as well as looking at value-based purchasing is important.
Thank you, Jeanne. Terrific.
Again, the API manufacturer in America, you have to be very careful as an American. Where do you source your APIs from?
All right. So, group, big discussion. Wow. All right.
Why don't we exchange
seats? Perfect. All right. Now I'm trying to think. Why don't we do this with some degree of logic? I will literally go from left to right from where I am sitting. So, sir.
Thank you. I'm Arthur Newberger. I'm a biochemist here in Cambridge. We heard in Fabrice's magnificent talk earlier about how biotech has the capabilities to potentially decrease inequalities, but also create inequalities.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'd like to link this back to our previous panels on digital health and precision medicine. And I could see if we jump into a far future, how the same could be true for digital health and precision medicine in terms of, drug or say healthcare affordability in general. We could use that to reduce, inequalities, but also create inequalities. And I do think that there's a chance to actually decrease inequalities by, making sure that people don't get sick in the first instance, but making cheap, preventive measures. A second thing I wanted to raise, and maybe Al could debate.
Sorry to interrupt, but is there a question?
Well, it's just something I wanted to point to is drug repositioning, drug repurposing is something that I think we don't do enough. We are sitting on tons of compounds which have been lost during the clinical development process. And we've seen from data, I've stated myself, that tons of these drugs can actually be used for medications.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the reflection. And that's an important one, so I'm not diminishing what you said in any way, but there's a lot of questions, so if you can get your question, and actually if I can ask that it's a single question. So, thank you.
I have a lot of questions, but I only have one most important one. I know that there's a difference, a law difference in India. I want to know what's the loss for the pharmaceutical companies comparing licensing it to the Indian pharmaceutical versus charging the patient for, say, $8,000. What's the loss in revenue?
Okay, I'll actually give Dr. Hamied a rest for one moment, and maybe Bill, do you want to answer that question about sort of loss in developed markets versus developing markets?
The way I look at it, it's not a loss because nobody can pay the $8,000.
Exactly.
So you're not going to sell a drug for $8,000. And in fact, most of the companies, Dr. Hamied's company, and I can mention a number of others, are making profits. It isn't that sometimes they're under pressure. The Indian government is continuing to squeeze down prices. At some point, it may reach a limit where the companies are no longer profitable, but they're pretty far from that at the moment. So you can make a lot of money. You don't have to make a 95% profit margin on your drug. You can do what most companies do with their products and have a 5%, 2% profit margin and have a thriving business. It depends on your volume. And so those companies aren't going out of business.
Thank you, Bill. I know Jeanne had a comment.
Just a quick comment, which is I think going back to why people who care about global health should care about US healthcare policy, a few statistics. Number one is that a recent report found that 70% of brand name drug profits are paid for by the US, even though our share of spending for OECD nations is about 46%. The US funds about 44% of world medical research and development, and about 75% of global venture capital and IP rights are held by the US. So we just have to remember that when we talk about US policy, I'm not doing it because I know it. I'm doing it because it does have these important effects. And going back to the policy debate, the report that put these statistics in one place was done by the Council of Economic Advisors under President Trump, who wrote, simply put, other nations are free riding or taking advantage of the United States in this area. Now that may be true, but as a former policy official, I'm like, but they can, because we're letting that happen, not because it's, and again, like, is it that we were trying to shift costs to other nations? I don't know. Is there potentially a lot of money that could be squeezed out of the industry? I might argue yes, because you talk about profitability, I think it's important to remember that the major drug companies, when you look at the top 25, their average profit margin fluctuated between 15 and 20% between 2006 and 2015. And when you look at non-drug global, globally top 500 companies, their profit margin is 4 to 9%. So just note that there is some profit, there's some waste in the system, there's some ways to lower the US drug prices that will help, I think, globally because of this trade-off.
Very good.
We talked a lot about innovative pricing and that it differs a lot from country to country, and that we need systems to help us come up with innovative solutions for the future. And I was just wondering how you feel for IP in your field. How do you think it will look like in 10 years? Do you think that we'll have an alternative to patents or regulatory collaborations?
Okay, alternative to patent law and different types of collaborations. I don't know, actually, Christina, if you want to say anything in terms of the way the industry is thinking about collaborating when it comes to market access, when it comes to value propositions, etc.
Well, I think it is the challenging topic right now, and industry recognizes that, I'm pretty sure, because, I mean, I can speak mostly for Europe. There are all kinds of discussions around how we can address these access issues and the affordability issues, and looking for things like performance-based schemes and all kinds of other innovative ways of addressing versus the more traditional techniques. And I think that is the way forward. On the other hand, I do recognize as well what panelists have been saying, that we should be looking at the holistic picture. I think what Jeanne mentioned before is really important, because there is a life cycle in all this, and there's a whole ecosystem, and trying to figure out how all these elements play in together. So yes, definitely in the future, I mean, we're seeing in Europe more innovative payment models, perhaps outcomes-based models, though they do have the complexity that goes with it that people sometimes are more reluctant to do. But the future is hard to foresee right now. I just want to say, though, that we do see patterns of spending changing. That's really interesting. When we're looking at, there's a recent study by IQVIA done, which really showed how drug spending is spread out. And you'll see that products that were traditionally a big concern in terms of cost, like anti-ulcerants or products for cholesterol or for hypertension, they're now taking a smaller part of the budget, and now you're seeing other areas like autoimmune and cancer increasing. So definitely you're going to see a different model happening there, but it does seem that there is some balance coming out. A lot of it is through genericization, because actually you're seeing a smaller percentage of these past products being spent, but actually more people being treated. So, I mean, there is a whole ecosystem to be looked at, I think, in terms of how all this will balance out in the future.
Perfect, thank you. Bill?
Well, I'm a big fan of patents. I think a fan of patents. I like patents because I think Benjamin Franklin put it, you want to add the fuel of self-interest to the fire of invention. Human beings are self-interested people. We are a self-interested species, and we do things for money. And we do a lot of things we wouldn't do otherwise for money. And I think that is a really important feature, that invention isn't only for invention, especially if you want to get paid to do the work. So patents are extremely important part of the ecosystem to create drugs. That doesn't mean that patents should inhibit the access to drugs. And I think that is the important debate to have. We need patents to create all the innovations, but we shouldn't let that interfere with the access to drugs. And that's why this debate, which is going on, which is what is the value you're getting for what you pay? It's a value-based medicine is a very important, and it's a relatively new concept that's being worked out. And Dr. Hamied described that. At the same time, as we heard from the gentleman from the United Nations, there are gross inequalities around the world and within countries. In my own country, in the United States, we have people who go without medicine because they cannot afford it today. And that was one of the reasons we had like 30, 40 million people were uninsured, and we may be going back to 20 or 30 million people uninsured. Not if we can help it, but it may be going that way. So there are gross inequalities, and the problem we all have in dealing with this is how do we solve that equation? One way is to make the drugs available in places, in poorer countries, make those patents available, and do what you heard Gilead does, and do that with what the HIV. That was a huge fight, by the way, to get that accepted, to have differential patent access around the world. It was a huge fight. I remember in Davos, some of the pharmaceutical executives saying, you can't allow the South Africans to have low-cost drugs. It's like slicing a salami. First they'll slice this piece off, then they'll slice the other piece off. It didn't happen. It worked out, and it's a good solution. Those are the kinds of solutions we have to work to. But to throw out the patent system, I think, would be sheer folly, because it would inhibit invention.
Thank you.
Just a quick comment to say, I think I agree with a but, meaning that if the goal is also to make sure that we had the R&D and innovation going on across the board where money may not be able to be the motivator, we have to figure out smart ways to do that as well. I mean, the National Institute of Health, they got another $3 billion this year. They spend $37 billion every year.
That's right.
If they could do models like what we saw Dr. Mondell say yesterday with his chart showing how do we target our investments per quality, dolly, whatever that would be for the greatest impact when there may not be the patent or money motivation. I think we just need to be very sensitive to the fact that not everything can follow the patent model, even though what has worked.
Thank you.
Thank you for that discussion. My name is Madhura. I'm a PhD student from Singapore. My question relates to something we discussed earlier regarding the pricing or the hiking of prices by pharma groups and stuff. So we know that a drug like Daraprim is still at like $750 per pill or something like that, and there's still no generic alternative to that. So when you have things like that happening, do you think that there is a need for us to have a more centralized regulatory system which controls the prices of drugs, regardless of which country that they're based in or the country that their primary market is?
Dr. Hamied, do you want to share?
I'll give you what has been my stand for pricing in India. India has a very hard government system of price control. And my suggestion has been very simple. I've told the government, but they don't listen to me, that if a drug is made by more than 5 people, it should be out of price control. Water finds its own level. The only way to reduce prices of drugs is by free competition. The drug you just mentioned, Daraprim, is, even though it's generic, is sold only by one company. It's a monopoly. The other thing I've told the government, that where there are drugs which are monopoly drugs, go into the costing if you want to. Number 3, I've told them, draw out a list of essential drugs which are either sold as monopoly or are under patent. Let the government decide which of those products are essential for India. And if they are essential for India, let the government speak to the companies. Like today, I know the Indian government is speaking to Johnson & Johnson for their new TB drug. Talk to the inventor, talk to the innovator. In what way can they come to India? Let's have a pragmatic approach to newer inventions and newer drugs. The older ones we can cope with. but it's the newer ones, under patent, monopoly, which on the pricing, we are talking about affordability, that is the issue for this category of drugs.
Thank you.
At the very beginning, we talked about you mentioned that there's 2 dimensions to it, right? There's value and then there's access. The question's focusing on the access dimension, specifically in the US, maybe directed more towards Dr. Lambrew. You mentioned 20% of the money goes to something in between. I suspect that's pharmacy benefit managers. I think the topic that's, I'll just finish my question.
Yes, please.
So that's what I wanted to talk about. First of all, question is, what do you think is the impact that they have in terms of access of the patients to the best treatment that they can get in the US? That's one part of the question. And the second one is, what is the impact of PBMs in the US for drug pricing?
Sure. And my only comment was, yes, PBMs are part of the 20%, but there's also physicians who take a share for like our Medicare Part B drugs and hospitals through the 340B program. So that bundle is their other intermediaries. So pharmaceutical benefit managers historically were used to pool resources and expertise for insurance companies that didn't have it internally, given the complexity of many of the pharma and biotech interventions. Fast forward to the fact that they got the same competition story happens. They boil down to 2 or 3 now that dominate the market. They often, to get the business with the insurance companies, will give them their own kickbacks and discounts, so the insurance company will make money off of the pharmaceutical benefit manager, and questionable value when information from different groups like Institute for Clinical Effectiveness Research and other organizations is out there that could do the work that a pharmaceutical benefit manager used to do. So there's a definitely big open question about that. Policy is addressing that in a very aggressive way in the US. And the market's also beginning to put pressure on them. I mean, I mentioned the JP Morgan trio trying to go after. They're going to go after pharmaceutical benefit managers first. There's mergers going on. So we certainly have seen United Health take over Optum and kind of like bring that in. Aetna and CVS are beginning to talk about merging because they want to bring this together. So I do think there's a government role, but there's also going to be a market response to low value add for these pharmaceutical benefit managers. But again, I don't want to lose track of the fact that that's not going to make a difference with these new drugs coming on with launch prices that are very high, because it is always, as one of my former colleagues said, the price is stupid, so how you come on market will affect everything downstream, and I think we have to keep an eye on that as well as these middlemen.
Thank you, Jeanne.
Hi, thank you. I'm an undergraduate student from the United States. I have a question directed at Dr. Haseltine and also Dr. Lambrew. You mentioned the price of value in our American healthcare system, specifically in relation to anti-PD-1 antibodies. Nearly every company on that list here will have an anti-PD-1 by the end of this year or by 2020. Should we change and revise the patent model such that biologics that are targeting the same mechanism are not protected for 20 years? Because if it's the same drug, why are we charging exorbitant rates for that? Thank you.
The simple answer to that is absolutely no. The more complicated answer to that is that each of those drugs may act differently, and you don't know which one is best. I've been involved in cancer and AIDS research for a long time. And what you see is there are many drugs. How many drugs are there that target the protease of HIV? How many are there that target the reverse transcriptase? Many. And there's a good reason for that, because they don't all work the same, and drug resistance occurs. And as the virus change, or as the cancer cells change, you may need different drugs, even for the same target. And if you're a patient with what would otherwise have been terminal melanoma, and you're the husband or wife of that patient, you're going to really be grateful for those patents that encourage the development of drugs that target the same topic. That's different from the question we're addressing, which is price, and what the value you get for those. And I think what we have to look at as society is, especially in most societies, we have an aging demographic. People who are older are going to have multiple diseases. They're going to have concurrent diseases, and they're going to be treated chronically for a very long time. We have to figure out, as we extend their lives, take that melanoma patient, That patient might have died. Now the patient's going to be alive for another 15, 20 years and going to require even more medicines. How are we going to handle those issues? Those should be built into our healthcare system, not necessarily our pricing of the drug.
And I would just add two things. One is that we did in the Affordable Care Act try to create, we did create a pathway for biosimilar approvals on a shorter time frame. The idea is, can we actually get some competition into the biologic market to make what we've seen in the other chemical compound markets work better? I will say it hasn't been the easiest process. We still don't have an interchangeable approved.
Right.
I'm disappointed in our ability to actually use that pathway effectively and well to date, but this is obviously a more complicated area of manufacturing, which could be part of
Well, it's a very big lobbying effort on the part of the people who have the control of that monopoly.
Correct.
To inhibit biosimilars. And it's one of the great disgraces of our pharmaceutical industry, in my opinion.
And to put numbers on that, the pharmaceutical industry, medical device industry, biotech, they spend twice as much lobbying our US system every year as oil and gas, who are the usual viewed culprits as the people who spend most of their time in the corridors of Washington. And it does make it very difficult for public policy to facilitate even pro-competition policies.
Right. For those of you who are not Americans, this may seem a little arcane, but we pay about, I think, close to half of our healthcare costs are paid by the government. The government cannot negotiate price with pharmaceutical industry, despite the fact that they buy more than half the drugs. And that's the result of lobbying of Congress. You cannot negotiate price, which is absurd on the face of it, and absurd in practice.
Would you call it corruption?
It's corruption, yes. It is corruption. It's corruption of the political system.
Okay, Christina, I might defend you for a second. You ready?
It's complicated.
She might call it honest graft.
No, in fairness, I think the problem we have is that people generally, and Americans especially, love cures. They want a cure, and a cure in the form of a pill is much better than a cure in the form of surgery, trust me. So there's that challenge. It's harder, I think, for our policymakers to take on something that could limit access or ration care. Second of all, going back to this valuation question, again, like, what is a life worth? And it's always hard generally. This is not unique to the pharmaceutical industry. I think it's particularly hard to do the input costs, the external costs of pricing for drug issues. So I just think it's especially hard, but I don't want to discount the fact that during the Affordable Care Act, we cut hospitals, we cut insurance company prices, we cut we tax medical devices, we tax pharma to close the donut hole. But the one area where we felt like we could not get as much savings was pharmaceutical. And this is not cost-free. This comes at a cost. We heard on the previous panel about the WHO and the investments they're trying to make across the board. So there's generalized societal investments that can't be made. There's other healthcare investments that can't be made. We couldn't invest as much in the prevention fund in the Affordable Care Act because we couldn't get as much drug discounts in the Medicare program. So it does come at a cost, and it might not be explicitly debated, but at some level it should be, because these are trade-offs that are happening in any system with fixed resources.
Thank you. Well, actually, I was actually going to wrap us up, conscious of the time that we have. But having said that, I actually was going to ask you a question first, Christina, and then come around the panel. So you can feel free to say what you want to say, but I just wanted to go around and wrap us up with one question, which is basically, and that's a question from me, team, sorry. That question is, we have a lot of leaders of tomorrow in this room that are passionate about the ideas and products that they want to see come to fruition. And for that, we're all hugely excited for you. But what's the one piece of advice you would have, and I ask this to each of our panelists in wrapping up, that you would give our leaders of tomorrow as they think about how best to ensure access for the ideas and products that they are passionate about? Christina.
Wow, okay, this could take a while. So first of all, and it's a semi-response, research as much as you can. And speaking of our company, I mean, in terms of what we invest in other areas and what we invest in R&D, we invest hugely and very heavily in R&D compared to anything else, any other areas of marketing or anything like that. But that's just a little sort of semi-response on the side. But I think you need to research a lot. And I guess depending on where everyone goes, I think if you perhaps end up in policy areas or payers or government areas, look at the data. I think the data speaks such a beautiful story. I mean, my job now is literally digging up data, and every time you open something and just look at some statistics, it's just a clear message. I remember when I was looking in the past, I won't name the country, it's changed since, I was looking at CT scans, you mentioned it earlier. It was like, for one country in Europe, there were like 300 and something per thousand every year. So basically 1 in 3 people were getting a CAT scan every year. Since it's gone down, but I'm just saying as a payer, if you look at the broader picture and if you suddenly look at the data, there's so much that will tell you. So for me, a lot about research, more broadly for medicines, because that's the future. And we all have families and that's what we hope for. But also looking at the data and making sure any decisions or and you're always driven by the facts and the figures. If you're in payer roles as well, I think trying to avoid silo mentalities as well. Looking at the broader picture is very important. The inefficiencies, it's true that pharmaceutical is always much easier to look at the price, whereas the broader efficiencies of the health system are very difficult to tackle. But in the UK alone, they're losing 5 billion per year just because of the inefficiencies. So that's a whole big chapter, but I just think it's so complex that no one can really start to tackle it. Have a passion in what you do, enjoy it, and always never forget your work-life balance and your the other things that are important in life, like your family and your health. And that's my little advice.
Thank you.
For what it's worth.
Thank you, Christina. Bill.
I see that I have 1 second.
I'm going to rely on Felix to say it's okay.
I'll be very brief. This is a very young group. It's a very exciting group. I've had an opportunity to talk to you. I would say there are 2 things that I would recommend you think about for your careers. The first is, what are you passionate about? What do you want to do? What is your internal purpose? And the second is, how does that match human need? How does your personal desire to do whatever it is you want to do match with human need in the broadest sense? And that doesn't come from studying your discipline. It comes from observation of the human condition. Whether you're reading literature, whether you're reading history, whether you're watching the news, whether you're traveling and looking at what human need is, how does your personal passion match your perception of human need in the broadest sense? And when you match those 2, you will guaranteed to have a fantastic career.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I know you're all doing this work primarily because you want to make a difference in people's individual lives, population health, in the nature of human health, which is an incredibly valuable thing, and thank you for that. Just keep in mind that public policy will affect your lives from beginning to end. So understanding it and engaging in it, participating in it is very important. And I will say that while there is corruption in any system, I came out of both of my stints in government more optimistic and more hopeful that individuals with commitment, intelligence, and hard work can make a difference. So please, if you ever have an opportunity to engage in public service, do it.
Thank you, Jeanne. Thank you. Dr. Hamied, you get the last word.
I get the second last. I would say that if you all are entering the pharmaceutical business, like I did many years ago, and I'm still involved, it's a very satisfying industry to work in because the objective is saving lives. And I think in this whole exercise later on in your life, you'll have to be very, very humble and understanding because you're in an area of health. And one of the things I would strongly recommend, which I'm noticing today, I'm not targeting anybody, is that when you come to drug pricing or something, be more human in your approach, not greedy in your approach. And that I would suggest, be more human in your approach, be humble, be more understanding with your fellow people, and particularly patients when they're suffering. Have you ever been in a hospital and seeing patients die? Well, it's a very sobering scene. Now, when I was your age and here studying, I never noticed all that till much, much later. And that made me more human in my approach, and therefore I'm preaching this to you all, that from now, learn what I've been telling you about.
Thank you, Dr. Hamied. It's true, I get the last word, and that's simply to say thank you.
Oh.
Thank you to each of you. Thank you to you. Terrific discussion.
Enjoy that.